We all know the story of the First World War, the guns of August, the fall of Imperial Russia, and the Austrian Empire. Indeed, many people very much remember it as a European war, even if we call it a world war. But probably the most important empire that fell for India's history was the Ottoman Empire. But it was in the Middle East, far from India, and closer to Europe. So how is it that events in Istanbul affected India thousands of miles away? That's what we're going to cover in this lecture. We're going to examine how Indian Muslim politics was affected by the First World War and how Indian Muslims' identity, largely due to the pressures of an Indian nationalism led by Gandhi and Hindus, started to shift more towards the Muslim component of their identity. First, we're going to examine the Indian Muslim self, or identity, and how it started to have changed by the 1910s. Second, we'll look at the Khilafat movement, which was a major Indian Muslim agitation against British war aims towards Turkey during the First World War. And last, we're going to examine the emergence of demographic politics and the fears inherent in some Indian Muslim political leaders, and how these started to generate support for a vaguely identified idea of Pakistan. When we step back, we'll see that some of the major impetus for the demand for Pakistan was forged in the trenches of the Mediterranean as much as they were in the plains of North India. Now, let's start with an overview of the Indian Muslim identity and self. The two components of Indian Muslim identity, being Muslim and Indian, have historically never really been in conflict with each other. And while all Muslims loosely held to the concept of Hakimiyat, or the ultimate sovereignty of God over the world, the reality of territorial loyalty has always been there. But as we've seen, these two components started to come into some tension with each other under the impact of colonial rule. In particular, Indian Muslims' wider worldview started to change in the 20th century. Now, let's think of our world history in the 1800s. What were European nations doing in the wider world? Colonizing, conquering, and ruling most of the world. The rise of European imperialism had a broader net effect of increasing many Muslims' global consciousness. The French had conquered most of North Africa. The Dutch had colonized most of Southeast Asia. The Russians had taken most of Central Asia, the Stans, and the British had claimed Egypt and the remnants of the Mughal Empire. The Ottoman Empire was also losing ground, territorially and in influence, to encroaching European nominal Christian nations. So as we can see, Muslim political power was in marked decline in the 1700s and 1800s. And India, remember, was the first major Muslim empire to fall to a nominally Christian Europe. So India's Muslims had a lot of time to digest and think about what had happened with their loss of sovereignty and all that had been changing under colonial rule. Most Muslims had largely made themselves, though, amenable to British rule and saw no conflict between being Muslim and being a subject of the British Empire, even if it was ruled by nominal Christians. But during the First World War, it all started to change. Broader trends outside of India in the Middle East and Europe galvanized Indian Muslim opinion, because these events bore directly upon Indian Muslim self-concepts of their own identity. Now remember, let's think about it. Who joined the side of Austria and Germany in the First World War? The Ottoman Empire. And for Muslims, remember, the Ottoman Empire was, at least symbolically, home to the temporal leader of the world's Muslims. It was the Caliphate. So when the British declared India at war with Germany and the Central Powers in 1914, it put Indian Muslims in the position of having to reconcile their territorial loyalty as subjects of the British Empire with their spiritual loyalties to the Ottoman Sultan as the nominal leader of the world's Muslims. In a way, Indian Muslims had to, at least in theory, choose which component of their identity mattered more, being Indian or being Muslim. Sunni Indian Muslims were in an awkward predicament. Were they to support the government upon whose protection they felt they depended, or to serve a larger duty to the Islamic world by supporting the Ottoman Caliphate? It's a hard one. So you can see the connections as a result of British rule almost forced Indian Muslims to take sides. Now, this was very significant. Never before had Indian Muslims had to confront this. But the colonial connection and British rule, because it entangled India with Britain's imperial wars, drew these dynamics out to be debated and contested, with disastrous consequences in 1947. This leads us to what we call the Khilafat movement, which lasted between 1916 and 1924. The Khilafat movement was very interesting, and it served to galvanize some elements of Indian Muslim opinion. It was effectively a lobbying effort on behalf of Indian Muslims to pressure Britain not to dismantle the Ottoman Empire after the war. Indian Muslims largely knew that Britain would win the war, and hence would be in a position to do as they pleased with the Ottoman corpse. Now, Istanbul is far away from India. What specifically do you think Indian Muslims were worried about? Well, think of the direction in which Muslims pray. That's right. They were concerned with the safety of the two holy cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina. There were also developments in India that got Indian Muslim leadership animated about the fate of the Ottoman Empire. As we know, Indian Muslims lost a lot under British colonial rule. Many old elites and landowners felt they simply weren't getting enough out of the British, and they pointed to a number of factors. The British, for example, refused to sanction an autonomous Muslim-oriented university, even though Hindus had a major one in the holy city of Benares. The British annulled the partition of Bengal from Muslim and Hindu districts back into one. And then there was the Kanpur Mosque incident of 1913, when the British demolished a mosque in a congested area to make way for a road. So you can see, to many Muslim leaders, not only had they lost their culture, influence, and sovereignty, but the British seemed to be rubbing their noses in it, whether it was in education, the fact that they ruled India, or an economic opportunity. So for many Indian Muslim leaders, they had had enough. So when the British forced Indian Muslims, both nominally and with the soldiers in the Indian army, to pit themselves against the spiritual leader of their religion, some of them decided to mobilize. So here's how it worked. The Muslim League and the Indian Muslim leadership needed help. So they turned to Congress. Now why? Weren't they a largely Hindu-run party? Well, because Congress could tap into the masses and possibly make the Khilafat movement a popular cause. And in 1916 in Lucknow, the old Shia Muslim capital of North India, Congress and the Muslim League inked what we call the Lucknow Pact. Congress agreed to support the League in pressuring the British not to dismantle the Ottoman Empire. It was interesting. It would present a united front against the British. So this was one major platform upon which Congress and the Muslim League agreed, at least temporarily. This also meant that when Congress launched non-cooperation in 1920, the League cooperated and coordinated with Congress. In fact, Gandhi himself was propelled to Congress leadership with the help of pro-Khilafat Muslim politicians. So the logic went like this. A united front of Hindus and Muslims working together for Indian nationalism was more powerful and convincing to the British than just one religious community standing alone. The British would have to take such unity seriously. The British would also be unable to dismiss Indian agitators as divided by religion, which they had done for generations. The Khilafat movement was led by two Indian Muslim brothers, Shaukat and Muhammad Ali. They were at the helm of the Khilafat movement, and they traveled to Palestine, Turkey, and Arabia to whip up support for their cause. They wanted to remind fellow Muslims that Indian Muslims supported them in their war, as they sought, against the British and a Christian Europe. But allying with the Congress also brought up major problems. Now think about it. Which Congress supporters might object to allying with a Muslim political movement? Well, the Hindu nationalists. But crucially, the Khilafat movement exposed a massive split in the Congress party. Many Hindu nationalists, frankly, didn't think this was in India's interest. Regional Congress leaders such as Pandit Madan Mohan Malaviya were crucial in enabling Congress to mobilize the wider countryside. But Malaviya saw the pact with the Muslim League as a capitulation to Islam, Indeed, he viewed the whole rubric through a communal and religious lens. To these Hindu nationalists, Indian Muslims had to get their priorities in order. Be Indian first and Muslim second. By this logic, the Khilafat movement was largely illegitimate in their eyes, and indeed a betrayal of Indianness. It suggested that, in terms of identity, Indian Muslims were Muslim first and then Indian second. Hindu nationalists resented what they saw as the Congress Party's sellout to Muslims. So some Hindu nationalists encouraged followers to aggressively display the power of Hindu majoritarianism. They had Hindu religious processions pass through known Muslim neighborhoods, sometimes on Fridays during prayers. They also whipped up anti-Muslim rhetoric in order to mobilize the often more conservative Hindu countryside. So one effect of Congress's pact with the Muslim League was to radicalize the more Hindu nationalist segments of support within the wider Congress party. This, in turn, bred a reaction from certain Muslim clerics and leaders. Some Muslim clerics implored Muslims to distance themselves from Hindus and to refrain from engaging in Hindu customs, celebrations, and in some cases, general goodwill. So let's stop and look at this. See how this could become a cyclical process? Now, let's turn back to the fallout of the war. In 1920, with Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire defeated, the Turks signed the Treaty of Sèvres with the major Allied powers, the United States, Britain, and France. This led to an Allied occupation of Istanbul and general agreements to partition the Ottoman Empire, and even American troops were stationed in Istanbul. For the Khilafat supporters, this was seen as clear evidence of the designs of Europeans and as a threat to the Caliphate, and thus to part of Indian Muslim identity. So by 1919, Indian Muslim cohesion through the Khilafat movement was at its highest. But as historians know, not all Muslims around the world wanted to keep the Turkish-led Caliphate alive. If we turn back to the Middle East, Arab nationalists, assisted by the famous T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia, were happy to see the Turkish yoke lifted. The Hashemite Arabs and the Saud family, both of whom would go on to rule the independent Arab states after the 1930s, would be able to rule themselves. They were happy to see the Turks go. But Indian Muslim Khilafat supporters were wary of Arab nationalism. Some of them bordered on the conspiratorial. Some Indian Muslims actually believed that Arab nationalism was a ploy developed by European and Christians to divide the Muslim world and conquer it. And back in India, the Khilafat movement didn't have everyone on board. Crucially, clerics from the Deoband seminary largely believed that so long as the British didn't interfere with the religious freedom of Indian Muslims, questions of the Caliphate were irrelevant. Other conservative clerics refused to support a movement which joined forces with Gandhi's Hindu-colored masses and mobilizations. So Indian Muslims were divided among themselves. The Khilafat movement started to lose steam. And what does any religious movement that loses steam start to do when it appears to be falling apart? Inject more religion into the cause. That always works, right? So the leaders of the Khilafat movement decided to make the case that any threat to the Ottoman Empire was a direct threat to the religious freedom of Muslims in India. Sound like an easy case to make? Not at all. It was a tough argument to sell. The Khilafats had difficulty mobilizing and gaining a unified consensus. Indian Muslims, as we've seen, were divided by region, sect, language, and geography. The Khilafat supporters, in a way, were upstart whippersnappers who had a tough time convincing Indian Muslims, let alone the revered clerics, that their religious freedom was threatened by the occupation of a Mediterranean city thousands of miles away. Some Khilafat supporters even made speeches that it was the duty of Indian Muslims to protect the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. But the great irony is that the British never went near the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina. They knew better. There was also a great deal of irony in the Khilafat cause. Punjabi Muslim troops helped the British conquer Iraq, Palestine, and helped tear apart the Ottoman Empire, a reality which would have later made Osama bin Laden seethe with anger. Britain used Muslim soldiers from India to dismantle the spiritual symbol of Muslim power, the Caliphate. The other great irony is that Bedouin Arabs from Arabia, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan were all more than happy to give the Turks the boot. And in 1922, the British decided to keep the Ottoman Empire intact as a matter of policy. But 2 years later, the Turks dissolved the Caliphate themselves. That long-standing symbol of Muslim power and authority was now consigned to the dustbin of history. What did this do to the Khilafat agitation and cooperation with the Gandhi and the Congress Party? Well, it actually took away a reason to agitate together against the Raj. This is when the Khilafat movement rapidly faded away. They had a hard time being relevant after 1924. Their bases of support and cooperation dissolved quickly. Some refused to give up the cause, believing that the new states of Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia were created by Europeans to divide the Muslim Middle East. Of course, they were constructions and somewhat artificial, these states. But we know that Imperial Britain did this with Arab support and desire for their own states and kingdoms. So some Indian Khilafat supporters continued their pan-Islamist activities, supporting Muslims in these occupied lands with weapons, medicine, and more broadly religious and political support. But these were a microscopic minority. These Indian Muslim political activists were overshadowed by Muslims who actually wanted to work with the Congress Party and use the constitutional mechanisms and reforms put in place in 1909 and 1919. These Muslims cared more about their own lot rather than those of their co-religionists hundreds of miles away in more desert-like lands. And the Ali brothers, well, quickly became irrelevant. They ran out of political capital back home. So they threw their support behind the newly installed House of Saud, which during the 1920s was becoming the ruling family of the Arabian Peninsula, and, crucially, the protector of the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina. But it's important to remember that these Saudi families struck alliances with fundamentalist Wahhabi Sunni Muslim leaders in the peninsula, who in a fit of iconoclast pique desecrated areas around the Prophet Muhammad's tomb in Medina, ridding it of any decorations and ornaments. And word got back to India that the Ali brothers had supposedly taken part in this fundamentalist iconoclasm. And when word spread, most traditional Indian Muslim clerics and Sufi followers were repulsed by this more austere sort of religiosity. The Ali brothers became the gadflies, if not the pariahs, of Indian Muslim politics. Now, what do you think happened to the Muslim League and the Congress Party now that the Ottoman Caliphate was gone? Did they have anything to really keep them and bind them together over the long term? Did they have anything with which to cooperate over now? Well, yes, the general struggle for freedom. But it was much less important than before. So one result of the end of the Khilafat movement was the accentuation of religious political rivalry in Indian politics. As Indian Muslims paid less attention to Middle Eastern affairs, they had to focus more on the real and indeed more pressing Hindu-Muslim political rivalries in key provinces of India, such as Bengal, Punjab, and Sindh. So was the Khilafat movement symbolic or was it substantial? It's really hard to say. I mean, it was the only significant Muslim organization in the world to champion the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. And the irony is that it came from India, not the Muslim core of the Middle East. The Ottoman Caliphate didn't have any real practical bearing upon the lives of Indian Muslims anyway, or their religious freedom. The Ottomans cared little for Muslims beyond the Persian lands, it would be fair to say, and were more concerned in the 19th and 20th centuries with keeping European power at bay. But the symbol of sovereignty which the Ottoman Caliphate represented, that of independence, self-rule, and pride, was something that was very appealing to some Indian Muslim political leaders. It was also, perhaps, a reminder of the very sovereignty that Indian Muslims once had. It was one which, in their eyes, they saw quickly crumbling under the onslaught of the West and of Europe. Now, let's turn to the fears that started to punctuate Indian Muslim political leaders' thoughts after the mid-1920s. The fears of these Muslim leaders were multifold. They started thinking to the future. And the main fear had little to do with religion. It had to do with political demographics. Indian Muslim leaders feared the power of the supermajority, or in India's case, a Hindu uber-majority. Hindus were roughly 80 to 85% of the entire Indian population. Now, the rise of a more publicly assertive Hinduism through the patronage of newly moneyed merchant families in temples, cities such as Haridwar, Allahabad, and Benares had a real impact. These visual displays got some Indian Muslims, those who thought in national and not provincial terms, wondering about their own future decades down the road. Now, many Indians figured they could get freedom from the British. This was clear, in a way almost inevitable. The only questions were when and on what terms, and what would it look like? Well, let's move across Eurasia to the wet fenlands of Cambridge in England. Here, an Indian Muslim student from the Punjab, Chaudhry Ramat Ali, was doing a degree at Emmanuel College, Cambridge. Ali, being educated and thinking in national rather than provincial terms, started to worry about the possible fate of India's Muslims if India would be given independence. He argued with such numbers, Hindus as a majority could easily run roughshod over the concerns of Indian Muslims, and these Hindus could possibly exclude Muslims from power. One day in the early 1930s, Ali was purportedly strolling the foggy court of Trinity College, Cambridge, and came up with the idea of a homeland called Pakistan. It was vague, undefined of an idea. He wrote in January 1933 a treatise entitled, "Now or Never, Are We to Live or Perish Forever?" And it read like this: "At this solemn hour in the history of India, when British and Indian statesmen are laying the foundations of a federal constitution for that land, we address this appeal to you in the name of our common heritage on behalf of our 30 million Muslim brethren who live in Pakistan, by which we mean the 5 northern units of India: Punjab, the northwest frontier provinces, Afghan province, Kashmir, Sindh, and Baluchistan. And we ask for your sympathy and support in our grim and fateful struggle against political crucifixion and national annihilation." Wow. Ali goes on to tap into the fear among many Indian Muslim nationalists that Hindu nationalism, which saw India as inherently a Hindu country and nation, was a threat to Islam in India. As he said, quote, "Our brave but voiceless nation is being sacrificed on the altar of Hindu nationalism, not only by the non-Muslims, but also, to their lasting shame, by our own so-called leaders with a reckless disregard of our protest and in utter contempt of the warnings of history." Again, wow. Ali also issued a stark challenge to the Congress and Gandhi, who claimed that India was indeed a nation rooted in an ancient and still solid civilization. Quote, "India, constituted as it is at the present moment, is not the name of one single country, nor the home of one single nation. It is, in fact, the designation of a state created by the British for the first time in history." Again, what a rebuttal. It includes people who have never previously formed part of the Indian nation at any period of its history, but who have, on the contrary, from the dawn of history till the advent of the British, possessed and retained distinct nationalities of their own. Ali would have been in good company, in retrospect, with the Viceroy, ICS officers, and British policymakers, for sure. They saw India as multiple nations. Now, this was the first major comprehensive political manifesto on the anxieties of Indian Muslim nationalists. It hit all the marks: anxiety about numbers, the fear of Hindu majoritarianism, the Muslim-held idea that India was not a nation but a collection of nationalities and regional cultures. But it was Ali's coining of the term Pakistan that was novel. Etymologically, it's a Persian word which means, quote, land of the pure. But it was also a geographical acronym. P was for the Punjab, A for the Afghan or northwestern provinces, K was for Kashmir, and S was for Sindh, and Stan was a Persian suffix for the western province of Balochistan. The British produced a religious demographic map. It was not accurate to the mile, but it gave a rough idea of where Muslims were largely concentrated in India. The provinces referred to by Ali were all the ones where Muslims were a majority, colored green on the map. Punjab, the Afghan northwest provinces, Sindh, Kashmir, and Balochistan. Yet curiously though, there was no mention of Bengal. And as we'll see, this would be problematic for the endgame of the British Raj in the mid-1940s, and even more so for independent Pakistan between 1947 and 1971. Now, the idea of Pakistan for Ali was still just an idea. He never said it would be a separate sovereign nation state. The closest he came was to call it a separate Muslim federation. But this could mean many things. It could mean a state, but federation means many other things as well. Was it to be part of a looser, more India-wide confederation, kind of like the Holy Roman Empire in medieval Europe? In this arrangement, we can see the logic of Indian Muslim nationalists. They wanted greater sovereignty for the provinces of India in which they were a majority. This meant that in these provinces where they were a majority, like the Punjab, Muslims would be able to protect themselves politically. They wouldn't be subjected to the political demographics of all India. So what many Muslim leaders envisioned was a looser federation with Muslim majority provinces coexisting with Hindu majority provinces. But the broader significance of this idea was that it represented the culmination of anxieties which were exacerbated by the interwar events of the Khilafat movement and the emergence, no doubt, of mass populist nationalism led by the Congress Party. It also represented a slight shift in the Indian Muslim identity when it came to politics, that some Muslim political leaders saw their Muslimness as interrelated to their Indianness. But many Indian Muslims didn't see it that way, and Hindu nationalists saw Indianness as more important than any foreign spiritual loyalties. Okay, so we've covered a great deal in this lecture, some real heavy stuff. We've looked at Indian Muslim identity and how it started to change by the 1910s. We examined the Khilafat movement and what it meant for Indian Muslim politics and eventual mobilization. And we saw how the fears of demographic politics started to generate support for a vague idea of a homeland known as Pakistan. As a result of these changes, Indian Muslim politics found its footing in the interwar years. Their identity, to some degree, had been tested due to the colonial connection and being forced to examine what it meant to be Indian while at the same time being Muslim. And it was the first time in their history that Indian Muslims really had to painfully examine their own identity. When coupled with the rise of mass demographic nationalism, it became inevitable that one major component of Indian nationalism would be, for better or worse, the Muslim question. So it's in this context that we should really see the eventual emergence of the state of Pakistan in 1947. It represented, to a degree, the net result of changes in Indian Muslim identity and power politics in India. But it did not necessarily represent the inevitability of those very significant changes which would come to pass in 1947.